If you remember back to chapter 1 and the properties of life and the hierarchy of life, you'll remember that the cell has a very special place in living things, and that can be summarized in the cell theory, which says that all living things are composed of at least one cell. Many living things are made of more than one cell. And cells are the smallest unit of living organisms, and that means the smallest unit that is life unto itself. So remember, we said living things are made of atoms too, but atoms are not alive. Cells are the smallest unit that is actually alive on its own. And the third part of the cell theory is that new cells come only from pre-existing cells. This occurs through cell division. So that means every single cell in your body arose through cell division from the fertilized egg, which was the first cell of you. And that fertilized egg came from your mother's cells, and your mother's cells came from the fertilized egg of your grandmother, and all the way back in time to the very first primitive cells on Earth. So this special role of the cell in living things is why we're going to dedicate a whole chapter to talking about just the basic parts of a cell, and the different things that are in cells, as well as the different types of cells. So every single cell on Earth, by definition, has 4 key features, or 4 things that, again, they must have in order to be described as a cell. And so let me get my pen here. So the first thing is a plasma membrane. So I'm drawing a little cell here. In this case, it's circular, but not all cells are circular, and we'll see some examples of this. So you obviously have to have a boundary, and that's the plasma membrane. The inside, sort of, you can imagine the cell kind of like a balloon, the air filling it, is the cytosol. And so this is a fluid or jelly-like substance that fills in the cell, and this word literally means cell, cyto, and sol for solution. So it's the fluid inside of the cell. Every cell also has genetic material in the form of DNA. And it takes on this structure called a chromosome. So a structural unit of DNA is a chromosome. And we'll talk more about these and see examples of these later in the semester. And then the fourth component that every cell has is ribosomes. Ribosomes are made out of RNA, specifically ribosomal RNA, or rRNA for short. And the ribosome is going to be responsible for making proteins. So at a minimum, cells will have these 4 components or structures. So you have all cells, so kind of creating categories here. Oops. We have all cells, and they have those 4 features. Then we begin to break them out into categories. So we have prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And the difference between them is the presence or absence of a nucleus is kind of the key difference. So prokaryotic cells do not contain a nucleus, while eukaryotic cells do. And that's in fact what the names prokaryote and eukaryote. Prokaryote means before the kernel. Eukaryote means with a true kernel. Kernel being a reference to the nucleus, which is this large visible object in the center of the cell. It's the largest organelle. It's usually the most visible, especially if you use a stain, and you'll get some experience with this in the lab. Prokaryotic cells, because they don't have a nucleus, are going to still have DNA, because the nucleus houses the DNA, but they'll still have the DNA, but it'll be in a region called the nucleoid, and it's just kind of floating around in the nucleoid region. Bacteria are examples of prokaryotes. Eukaryotes, again, they have a true nucleus. That means there's a membrane surrounding it called the nuclear envelope. So if I were to sort of draw a little mini prokaryotic cell, eukaryotic cell summary, right? The eukaryotic cell has this large nucleus in the middle, and that's where the chromosomes and DNA is. The bacterial cells, or prokaryotic cells, they still have the DNA, and it's concentrated in a specific area called the nucleoid, but it doesn't have that extra membrane. So this is a nucleus, this has DNA, but it's just floating in the cytosol. Eukaryotic cells, and that's not reflected in my drawing, are usually much bigger, right? So if I were to draw this to size, it'd be more like this for the eukaryotic cell. And again, you're going to see this in the lab, how much bigger they are. In addition to having the nucleus, eukaryotic cells are also going to have structures called organelles. So notice the relationship to the word organ. These are structures within the cell that have specialized function, much like organs in your body have specialized functions. Organelles are by definition wrapped in membrane. And so if I'm going to start to build a eukaryotic cell here, I'm going to have lots of other structures that are floating around in the cytosol. And they have membrane surrounding them and some other stuff going on inside of them. Okay, so eukaryotic cells more complex with these organelles. This is also called compartmentalization. So there's compartments in the eukaryotic cell, whereas everything in the prokaryotic cell is just floating around in the fluid. Plants and animals are examples of eukaryotic cells, as are fungi and protists, and you're going to look at those in the lab. So prokaryotic cells, as I sort of illustrated already, have a really simple cell structure. They have a membrane, they have ribosomes, they have cytosol, they have genetic material, but they do not have a membrane enclosed nucleus. They do not have organelles. Bacteria is kind of the classic example of a prokaryotic cell, as are archaea. Remember, those are two domains. Domain bacteria, domain archaea are both prokaryotic. They're small and simple. Bacteria are really common. You'll read in the lab that, in fact, there's more bacterial cells in our body than human cells. That's how abundant they are. Most of them are not harmful. They're either neutral or in many cases they're beneficial. And in fact, that's what probiotics are. Probiotics are really just beneficial bacteria. Archaea is the other domain of prokaryotic organisms. They're less common than bacteria, and they're often associated with extreme environments like thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean and places like that. So this is an example of a bacterial cell and the basic structures that the bacterial cell has. So it's got a plasma membrane, that's this pink on the inside here, and then bacteria also have a cell wall. We'll see that this is something that plants have, but the cell wall of bacteria is very, very different from plant cell wall. So even though we call it the same thing, just be aware that it is not the same as a plant cell wall. Inside of the cell, it's got the fluid, that's the cytosol, and then floating around in there, you've got your genetic material in the nucleoid region. So remember, there's no membrane around it, so it's not a nucleus. We've got ribosomes in there, all the things that a cell has to have. In addition, many bacterial cells will have these structures called pili. We'll talk about these also later in the semester, but they help the bacteria attach to things or participate in specialized reproductive processes. They also many times have flagella, so you can see here there's many flagella on this bacterial cell, and that's going to be for motion. We'll also see the term flagella in plant and animal cells, or rather, yeah, plant and animal cells. But just be aware that even though we use the same term, they're structurally very different, kind of like the cell wall. So that's a typical bacterial cell. It mainly just has the basic things you need to be a cell, and with a couple of little extras like flagella for movement. The last thing here that I haven't mentioned yet is the glycocalyx, which coats the cell wall. It's kind of interesting because it's a little bit like a slime layer. It can help bacteria move, help them stay moist should they end up outside of their host, and afford them a little bit of protection. Eukaryotic cells, their key difference is that they have DNA inside of the nucleus, but they're also going to have all these organelles, and that's this term compartmentalization. So organelles are these subcellular, so smaller than the cell structures, that are surrounded by membrane, and again, kind of like organs, they have specialized structures and functions. Cells are going to vary a lot in shape, like what they look like, circles, squares, oblongs, size. You can have very large cells, very small cells, even within the same organism, and how they organize into tissues can be really different too. It can differ among species, it can differ between individuals, between tissues. So just be aware that we're going to use some simplistic examples, but actually you have a lot of variation in what cells look like. We're going to also focus just on an example plant cell and an example animal cell. So kind of like model plant and animal cells that, again, don't represent every type of cell in a plant or every type of cell in an animal, but give us a little snapshot of what those cells have in them. And so this is the figure from your text of the animal cell structure. You do need to be able to label these for both the exam and the lab practical. So I'm just going to comment on the places where this is different from the plant cell. So animals have a lysosome, and they also have the centrosome with centrioles. Those are two yellow things in here that plants don't have. If we look at the plant cell, again, it has mostly the same structures as the animal cell. The key differences are that there's the cell wall, which is this exterior here. Again, it's not the same as the bacterial cell wall, but does differentiate plants and animals. Plants also have the central vacuole, which is unique to them. And in addition, they have chloroplasts, which is unique to them. So again, you need to be able to label the different parts of a plant cell. Now in the next video, we're going to go through these different parts of the cells and talk about what they do.